So as I'm sure a lot of you are aware, there's quote-unquote simulators for virtually everything nowadays. Farming simulator, PC building simulator, cooking simulator, freaky goat simulator. But before there was a simulator for everything, there were Tycoon games. And while it wasn't the first to bear the name Tycoon, today's ancient DOS game, Railroad Tycoon, was definitely the first to set the standard of what to expect from a game with Tycoon in the name, combining simulation aspects with an overarching goal of raking in lots and lots of cold hard cash. At least, that's how it's supposed to go. Almost every game with Tycoon in the title also shares another trait, and that's being freaking hard as balls. Not those kinds of balls. No. Perfect. Yeah, I gave this game multiple shots, but found myself struggling every step of the way, and frequently running myself into dead ends, because it is very easy to make simple mistakes, which can derail all of your plans. No, I'm not apologizing for the pun. Although really, I'm just being facetious. When it comes down to it, this game is pretty innovative for the time, and offered quite the variety of challenges to overcome, along with a highly customizable experience in terms of realism. But yeah, for as much as I wanted to enjoy this game, the clunky interface, combined with no mercy for making mistakes, really hampered my enjoyment of it. Railroad Tycoon is another game developed by the MPS Labs division over at MicroProse under the guidance of game designer Sid Meier, and was published in 1990 as a one-player simulation game, although it kind of borders on being strategy instead of simulation, and in fact I've seen this described as a strategy/simulation game as well. Quite frankly, when you play on the lowest skill settings, your biggest enemy is yourself, not the AI. That's why I decided calling it a straight-up simulation game was more apt. But at higher difficulties, the strategy element does play much more of a factor. It supports CGA 4 color, Tandy 16 color, EGA 16 color, and MCGA 256 color graphics, all running at 320x200 resolution, and also supports the AdLib, PC speaker, Roland MT32, and Tandy 3 voice sound devices. Although, something I should point out is that the copy I have was actually made to be part of a software bundle to be included with new PCs. And in fact, the specific PC my copy was destined for was equipped with a Pro Audio Spectrum card. The way I can tell is that the AdLib option on startup has been altered to read Pro Audio Spectrum. But really, it's still AdLib. The pass has the same chips and support necessary to run AdLib sound, the same as an AdLib card or even a Sound Blaster card. Also, what the heck is up with that version number? Weird. Anywho, as for its current release date, believe it or not, the game's freeware. Yes, seriously. The first telltale sign that this is the case is that if you go around to GOG and Steam, you'll see that the second, third, and technically fourth games in the series are all available, but not the first one. Well, what happened is that when the fourth game in the series was announced back in the mid-2000s, simply titled Railroads, the very original game was made available as a free download. Now, the link to the free download page has since been removed, but the free download page itself actually still exists on the 2K Games website, and I can confirm as of this recording that the game download itself still works too. So the exact link to follow if you want to download this game is www.2kgames.com/railroads/downloads.html. As for physical copies, the plus side is that there's very little demand for this game, so complete in box and even brand new copies tend to go for between $15 and $30, and because of the manual-based copy protection, most copies you come across will be complete in box. That said though, there aren't many copies up for sale at any given moment, and it's easy for them to get buried amongst all the different box variants and sequels, so you're going to have to wade through all of that to find the specific physical copy you're looking for the specific target platform. Though the DOS version is definitely the most common out of all of them. When you first load up the game, you have the option to start a new railroad, load an existing railroad, or run the tutorial map. Unfortunately, as was common with late 80s and early 90s games, the tutorial map is literally just that, a pre-made map which you're meant to alter while following tutorial steps in the manual. But hey, better than no tutorial given how complex this game can get. When starting a new railroad, you have to select your overall difficulty, represented by various businessmen playing a game of poker, ranging from an investor, to financier, to mogul, to tycoon. This doesn't so much affect the simulation itself, rather it affects your competition and how well they're able to do their thing while you're playing. Curiously, the difficulty level you select also affects how long you're allowed to play the game for, though when you reach the time limit for your selected difficulty, you're allowed to bump the difficulty up to continue playing. This is not really a bad thing, just kind of weird. There's also 3 realism settings: collisions, economy, and competition. With collisions off, when 2 or more trains try to pass each other without enough tracks available to do so, one of them will be shoved aside and stopped while the others pass. With collisions on, you now need to worry about signaling and need to take steps to ensure your trains don't have a chance to run into each other. The economy setting can be either basic or complex. In basic mode, you can sell any goods to any stations. The drawback being you can't store goods at these stations to be picked up by different trains throughout elsewhere. Whereas in complex mode, certain kinds of map tiles will affect what can be traded for cash at the various stations you set up. Though if a station's not buying a particular resource, you can still drop it off there for later pickup, given proper storage facilities. The last setting simply affects if your opponents will buy your stocks or not, since if at any time you do not have the controlling stake in your stocks and the investors feel you're doing a bad job, you can be voted out of position and lose the game. Now, one thing that's neat is that even though there's 4 maps to choose from, the contents of those maps are randomized to a small extent, meaning each playthrough on the same map is very liable to go completely differently based on what resources can be found where and what businesses exist within proximity of each other. Each map also takes place during a different period of time, so the trains available will be very different between all of them. Generally speaking though, I found the further back the clock was scrolled, the easier the map was, just due to the trains themselves costing less to purchase and maintain. But once you've got your game going, you're probably going to want to freeze time ASAP so that you can spend a few moments scouting out where you want to start your railroad. Once you lay your first bit of track, all tracks laid from that point onward need to connect to each other, so planning very far ahead is pretty much required if you want to survive in this game. Which is part of the reason I wasn't so good at it, because I don't plan ahead that far in advance very well. Now, there's actually 4 different views you can toggle from this main gameplay screen here: the regional display, area display, local display, and detail display, in order of most zoomed out to most zoomed in. Now, each display also provides information the other display modes don't. The area and local displays show an overview of your train routes and stations, with the local display also showing topography, while the detail display is used for building. Regardless of the display mode, the mouse buttons are used to both adjust the camera and select things. So this can get a bit awkward, how you'll sometimes click on something and the view will shift instead of giving you information like you wanted, or vice versa if you didn't click close enough to the edge of the view. Building tracks is kinda simple, but made awkward due to being forced to use the detail display. Basically, you click where you want to start building tracks from, then use the numeric keypad with numlock on to build a rail into the tile you're moving the selection cursor into. Note too that given how DOSBox handles numlock, you may need to flip it off and on again just to get it working properly. Now you remove tracks in much the same way after toggling the remove mode in the menu. However, in order to start making some cash, you need some stations and trains. Now, there's 3 sizes of stations you can build, each one capable of reaching a larger amount of people, indicated by the various squares shown when you're deciding on what kind to build. The more different locations inside your station's range, the more passengers and mail there will be, along with more options for what commodities will be available for pickup and what can be sold off at the station. You can kind of get an idea of how this is going to go by clicking on a location on the detail view to get more info about what it supplies and what it demands, but I've noticed this isn't very accurate for cities and villages, only specialized locations like power plants, coal mines, grain elevators, etc. So it may take some trial and error on the different maps to get an idea for what commodities the cities and villages themselves are going to be demanding. It's also important to note that the very first station you build gets a free engine shop upgrade, as you would otherwise be unable to build any trains without one. Building a train simply requires you to select an engine, and then add on some cars if you so desire. You're then taken to the routing screen. Now each train you own can be routed to travel up to 4 destinations in sequence before returning to the original destination. You can also set up car changes, force the train to wait at a destination until fully loaded, and you can also set a priority change, which we'll talk about in a bit. And keep in mind that making even just a small change to your cars delays getting your train back to action by quite a bit. So you'll only want to change cars if you'd otherwise be traveling a long distance with useless cars and want to keep your top speed higher. Also remember that when you make car changes, you have to define every car that will be coupled, not just which ones will change. Now, if you want to remove all cars entirely, you use the caboose only option. You can also completely change the engine for a train from this screen. You'll sometimes need to do this just by nature of engines getting old and being more prone to breakdowns, but you'll also sometimes want to do this to upgrade to a new, faster, better engine. Though just because an engine is faster doesn't mean it's good for what you need it to do. You can pull up info on the various engines available to you to get an idea of how many cars it can haul in total, how fast it can go with various quantities of cars, and how much it'll be slowed down at various grades of incline. Yeah, one thing that's sure to trip up new players is that the height of the land fluctuates, and it's not really visualized very well. Mountainous areas and rivers are clearly laid out, but you need to perform a survey in the detail display to actually see the height values to understand just how much of a change there is between two tiles, especially since changes tend to begin before the tiles indicating these natural formations. It should be noted that these height values are not super expressive of the actual grading going on, plus whether or not your track is curving or going straight plays a factor too. Generally speaking though, a difference of 15 points is roughly a grade of 2%, and any grade level of 1.7% or greater will trigger a warning to let the player know that trains may struggle somewhat going against the incline. Any grade higher than 3% should probably be avoided entirely, as you'll rapidly reach a point where a train may simply not be able to ascend at all. Once you have a train going, the primary simulation begins. Now, something I find amusing is that these trains don't really go as fast as they should. I mean, yeah, trains in the early days were pretty slow compared to modern trains, but you'll notice the months pass seemingly way faster than you'd expect them to, which kind of breaks the immersion for me in that it should not take a whole year for one of my trains going 40 miles an hour to cross half the USA on a limited route. Oh yeah, I almost forgot. You can set each train to be one of 4 kinds of routes: local, through, express, and limited. Basically, local routes will stop at all stations between their scheduled stops, through routes will not stop at small depot stations, express routes will not stop at small depots or medium-sized stations, only terminals, while limited routes will only stop at scheduled stops and nowhere else. Once you have some trains going, you'll probably wonder what you're supposed to do next. Well, the whole point of the game is to make money. So it's basically a balancing act between laying tracks to create new routes and adding trains to travel the new tracks in the hopes they'll bring in a return on your investment. In fact, there's a lot of financing mechanics going on in the background. When you open your reports menu, you'll see that there's lots of pertinent information you can bring up, including the balance sheet, an income statement, profitability notes for your individual trains, as well as information on how your stocks are doing. Because yes, you can invest in stocks, both your own and those of your rival railroad moguls. Something I should point out is that the whole stock system is probably not going to play a huge factor on lower difficulty levels, as I've found the AI on lower difficulties frequently makes huge mistakes and ends up with a completely unprofitable railroad. Thus, their stocks tank, they get driven out of business, and eventually some other AI player takes their place. Whereas on the higher difficulty settings, banking on your rivals to improve faster than you may be a good way to get some extra cash in the long run if you have enough cash short term to make the investment. You can also float some bonds, but quite frankly, the sooner you can get out of the bond you start the game with, the better. Not to mention, if you do this, you won't be allowed to intentionally travel very far into negative cash flow. Also, everything related to stocks and bonds happens through your broker, whom you have to call. Thus, the call won't be completed if the game speed is frozen. Which, again, it's weird and clunky, but at least I get what they were going for. Actually, let's talk about some of those clunky things. Firstly, even though the game is merciful and will return some of your cash when you demolish tracks you don't need anymore or made by mistake, the game's not quite so forgiving about mistakes in building stations or bridges. Well, you can still demolish them, but now you're down the cash. It's important to place your stations for maximum long-term effectiveness, even if you don't plan to build them to the required size at first. But also keeping in mind, if you intend a station to be the end of a route, or if you want the route to continue past the other end of the station in the future, that kind of planning ahead is essential to surviving this game. Another thing that's bound to trip you up are double tracks. Now, that should be obvious, a train track can only have one train traveling at a time. Now, you can double up any section of track you want by moving the selector over it in the detail display and pressing Shift D to spend some cash making a double track, which can handle 2 trains at a time. The trouble, though, is that you're bound to make the mistake of thinking that you can create a route between 2 points, which passes through a huge stretch of single track that has a highly active route on it already, and now you've invested all that money and effort to make a route, which is going to mess up profits without first doubling a massive stretch of track. Doubling tracks is better suited for small sections in order to allow 2 routes to merge for a short distance due to the costs involved. Now, speaking of laying tracks, this is done using the numeric keypad, plopping down track pieces in the directions you press. You'll quickly notice, however, that not all the directions of travel are possible. You can only make a 90-degree bend as a corner, and even then it will drastically slow trains down when they try to pass through it. To make an intersection requires a 45-degree offshoot from the main line, which means if you want your trains to move more flexibly to be able to connect back up to the main route, you need to create 2 more intersections to create a triangular section, which allows trains from one route to reach either connecting route. You'll probably end up making a lot of triangles like these in the future, so you should probably get used to doing so. And definitely the most clunky thing of all are the priority shipments. And every so often you'll get a news flash indicating a priority shipment is ready to take from one location to another, and if you can do it really fast, you'll get a sizable chunk of cash. There's 2 problems though. The first is that unless you're incredibly lucky, there's no way you're ever going to make the priority shipment fast enough to get even half of what's initially offered, just by nature of how fast the trains are compared to how rapidly the bonus value drops. The other thing is that you can only have one priority change set at a time. This means as soon as a train hits your first priority destination to make the pickup, you typically immediately have to set up a priority destination for the delivery and hope that the train hasn't turned around in the process and got away from your destination. It's also really important to set the priority destinations and car configurations for both the initial pickup and delivery stops. Otherwise, the normal route may take over and completely throw the priority shipment out of whack. Also keep in mind that if you set a priority for car changes but not for a destination, the cars will only change the prioritized configuration if the next stop does not also have a non-priority change set, which is stupid and has messed up me up like more than once trying to go through this. In the end, one way or another, it'll come time to retire, either by quitting the game or reaching the time limit for the difficulty level you selected. When you retire, you'll be given a job based on how well you did, and get to see an image of your character in their new profession. Now, just like with every other aspect of the game, the different maps affect what professions are available, and it's kind of impressive that they went this extra mile just for a feature few people are going to pay much attention to. Overall, I didn't like Railroad Tycoon, but I saw the potential for sure. If the game was a little more user-friendly and a little more forgiving of mistakes, it'd be way more fun. And I imagine once you get used to these aspects and get a feel for the game's mechanics, you can make decent progress for sure and have lots of fun playing. But you have to get to that point first, and I couldn't. I just got so frustrated every step of the way. One of the first stations I ever made had both a sheep farm and a textiles factory in range, so you'd think the cotton would just immediately get turned into textiles, but nope. I would have had to literally make a tiny loop for a train to run back and forth between to pick up the cotton from the station and then deliver it to the same station to be paid for it and turn it into textiles. That's kind of a glaring oversight, really. And I refuse to believe that I had to do that, so I never did. And that's kind of how all my runs went, is I'd run into some kind of hurdle and it would just completely throw all of my planning out of whack. I've got a funny feeling I might enjoy the later Railroad Tycoon games if these kinds of things were improved, but this initial foray is just too rough around the edges for me. Still, given that it can be obtained for free now, you're definitely able to download it for yourself and make your own determination. Just don't get the copy protection question wrong, or else you're restricted to just having 2 trains at a time. Which is actually kind of a neat thing. The game actually still lets you play it if you fail the copy protection, just with a handicap like that. As with most early MicroProse titles, you need to set a fixed cycles count to avoid strange delays due to how the game does its timing. I recommend a setting of 20,000 cycles. Yep, that's all it takes to get this running in DOSBox. Anywho, that's all for today's episode of Ancient DOS Games. Next Saturday on ADG Pro, we're going to be investigating some deeps, aka DPS, damage per second. And we're going to be doing it in a cult classic, high-resolution 3D DOS game, which not only doesn't tell you what the deeps are, but doesn't even have numerical values for damage listed anywhere. So, figuring this out is sure to be an interesting challenge, so make sure to stay tuned for it. Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to those of you supporting me on Patreon. Here's just a small random selection of you all.